You know, it's not easy being the youngest in the family. Those of you who are the youngest in your family know what I'm talking about. I'm the youngest of 4 in my family, and it hasn't always been easy. Like when we get together every now and then and pull out the family photo album. There are like 1,000 pictures of my oldest sister, Marion, when she was a baby. Marion when she was first born. Marion when she came home from the hospital. Marion when she first raised her head. Marion when she held her head this way. Marion when she held her head that way. A ton of pictures of Marion. And for the young folks in the crowd today, remember, this is back in the day when pictures were a big deal. Parents didn't have cell phone cameras and Facebook to post their photos on. They had to really want to take pictures. They had to have a camera and then have the film developed and then put them in a photo album, right? And when it came to the firstborn, my parents certainly were serious about pictures. But as more kids showed up, their enthusiasm began to wane. And by the time they got to me, well, I'm just lucky there are any pictures of me as a baby. It's the same way with home movies, too. We have movies of my sister growing up until the age that she was 12 years old. I would have been around 6 at the time. And then the movie camera broke. Now, do you think my parents went out and got another one? Heck no! They already had 12 years of movies. Why would they want any more? But that's the sort of things that happen in families. As time goes on, the novelty and fascination of it all wears thin. And no matter how wonderful we like to think our children are, at some point we just accept that they're all pretty much the same, and we don't have to record every little event in their lives. It's all pretty normal. It's all pretty ordinary. Well, you know, it really wasn't that much different for Jesus either. When you read the 4 Gospels, you realize that there are lots of stories about Jesus when he was first born, when he was still a baby. But then, with the exception of one story, when he was 12 years old, we don't hear anything about Jesus until he's 30 years old and beginning his public ministry. We know nothing about Jesus for the bulk of his life, for the time when he lived with his father and mother and learned a trade. And all we can conclude from that is that Jesus must have led a pretty ordinary life for those 30 years. Nothing extraordinary, nothing worth writing down during the time. Just an ordinary life with his mother and father and doing his job. Now, interestingly enough, there were some early Christians who couldn't accept the fact that Jesus lived just an ordinary life during those years. So they wrote down stories of their own about Jesus growing up. Many people are not aware that there were more than 20 Gospels written about the life of Jesus. Only 4 of them, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, made it into the Bible. And when you read those other Gospels, you can see why. Several of them have all sorts of stories about Jesus growing up that made him out to be an extraordinary child. One story has Jesus making birds out of clay. And then, bored with the fact that these were just clay birds, Jesus claps his hands and they become real birds and fly away. In another story, Jesus is helping Joseph in the carpentry shop when, unfortunately, Joseph cuts a beam of wood too short. And since wood was valuable back then, this was quite a problem for Joseph. But Jesus says, "No problem, Dad," and he grabs hold of the beam and he lengthens it to the right size. Not a bad kid to have around, huh? Then there's this really odd story about how Jesus is playing in the yard one day, and some kid who he doesn't particularly like very much runs into him. So Jesus strikes the kid dead right then and there. All of these stories would certainly have indicated that Jesus was an extraordinary child. But you have to admit, they're awfully bizarre. And the early church saw that right away, and as a result, rejected them as authentic stories about Jesus. The church was quite comfortable with the idea that Jesus was ordinary for most of his life. And it certainly wasn't willing to accept bizarre stories about him just to believe otherwise. And sometimes that's what we have to accept and be comfortable about our own lives. That for the most part, we're just ordinary folks. But often, many people have trouble accepting who they are. They believe that in order to be special, to be of value, they have to accomplish extraordinary things in their lives. Or they have to own extraordinary homes or cars. Or they have to wear extraordinary clothes or jewelry. They see the value of their lives based on the externals. And if they can't accept who they are inside, then even the external things they accomplish or own can't compensate for their lack of self-acceptance. People who are always unhappy or angry or easily annoyed or constantly frustrated or resentful, those folks are often people who can't accept who they are, and they want to be someone else. Or people who are always criticizing or judging others, gossiping constantly, putting others down, are often people who aren't happy with themselves. And so they think they can feel better about themselves by putting other people down. But nothing can substitute for understanding who we are and accepting ourselves as we are. And that's where this feast of the Holy Family comes in. The holiness of a family, just like the Holy Family, comes not in accomplishing or owning anything extraordinary, but in living out an ordinary life in love and care. In the letter to the Colossians, we're not told that our greatness comes from what we do or what we possess. It comes from our relationships with one another. Listen to the letter. Put on, as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, heartfelt compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience, bearing with one another and forgiving one another. This is not an overly romanticized view of life. It recognizes that in the day out and day in drudgery of life, that our relationships can be strained with one another, and therefore we have to be mindful how we treat each other. There'll be times when we're going to focus so much on our own needs that we're going to neglect the needs of others. And so we have to put on heartfelt compassion. There'll be times when others are going to push our buttons and annoy the heck out of us. And so we're going to have to put on kindness and gentleness and patience. There will be times when others will be in the spotlight and we'll be tempted to prove ourselves by bragging about our own accomplishments. And instead, we'll have to put on humility. And of course, there will be times when people hurt or offend us. Sometimes unintentionally, sometimes deliberately. And we'll have to reach deep down into ourselves to find the grace to forgive them. But in the end, the best advice from the letter of the Corinthians is simply this: bear with one another. Sometimes, when it's all said and done, that's the best we can do for each other. After our compassion, our kindness, our gentleness, our patience, and our humility, and even our forgiveness have all worn thin, all we can do is simply bear with each other. And that's okay. Because in the end, we're not holy because of anything we do or say or own. We are holy because we are God's chosen ones, holy and beloved. And that's what gives us value. That's what allows us to be ordinary people living ordinary lives. And so we don't have to be super moms or super dads, or we don't have to prove ourselves by showing off or putting others down. We simply have to remember that we are God's chosen ones, holy and beloved. And as the beloved of God, we're called to share that love with others, beginning with our own families. I doubt I'll be seeing a psychiatrist anytime soon about not having many pictures of me as my oldest sister. I can accept the fact that that's just an ordinary reality of life. But when I look at the love and care that is in my family, and when I see that same love and care in so many other families, I can see how much holiness there is in our families. When I look at the love here in our own parish family, I can see how much our holiness reflects the holiness of Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. I can see how much we are truly God's chosen ones. And that's extraordinary enough. Amen.